Why German tanks performed so poorly in the Battle of the Bulge. Analyzing the factors behind their failures. On December 17, 1944, as the German Wehrmacht launched its final major offensive of World War II, known as the Battle of the Bulge, the expectation was that their armored forces would once again spearhead a devastating breakthrough, reminiscent of the Blitzkrieg campaigns that had stunned Europe earlier in the war. However, the reality of the Battle of the Bulge was starkly different. The German tanks, particularly the heavily armored Tiger IIs, struggled significantly throughout the campaign, leading to a failure that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. This analysis explores the multifaceted reasons behind the poor performance of German tanks during the Battle of the Bulge. Terrain and weather. The Ardennes as an unforgiving battlefield. The Battle of the Bulge took place in the Ardennes, a region characterized by dense forests, rolling hills, and narrow, winding roads. This terrain was far from ideal for the large and cumbersome German tanks, particularly the Tiger II, also known as the King Tiger. The Tiger II was a behemoth, weighing 72 tons and equipped with thick armor that made it nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. However, this massive size also made the Tiger II incredibly unwieldy, especially in the confined spaces of the Ardennes. The narrow roads and densely forest paths of the Ardennes were not built to accommodate such heavy and large vehicles. Many of the routes were nothing more than dirt trails, barely wide enough for the Tiger II to pass through. This created significant bottlenecks, slowing down the German advance and making the tanks vulnerable to ambushes. The muddy and wet ground further compounded these difficulties, as the heavy tanks often became bogged down, unable to maneuver effectively off-road. The winter conditions in the Ardennes also played a crucial role in hampering the effectiveness of the German tanks. The snow-covered landscape reduced visibility and made navigation challenging, while the cold temperatures strained the mechanical components of the tanks, leading to frequent breakdowns. The Panther tanks, although lighter than the Tiger II, also faced similar issues with the terrain and weather, further diminishing their combat effectiveness. Logistical challenges, fuel shortages, and mechanical failures. One of the most significant factors contributing to the poor performance of German tanks during the Battle of the Bulge was the chronic shortage of fuel. The German war machine was already suffering from a severe fuel crisis by late 1944, and the demands of the Ardennes offensive only exacerbated this issue. The Tiger II, in particular, was notorious for its poor fuel efficiency, consuming nearly 2 gallons of fuel per mile. Given the vast distances that needed to be covered in the offensive, the lack of fuel severely limited the mobility of the German armored units. The German High Command had planned to capture Allied fuel depots during the offensive to resupply their tanks, but this strategy proved largely unsuccessful. The American forces, aware of the German need for fuel, were quick to destroy or secure these depots, leaving the German tanks stranded without the necessary resources to continue their advance. Many German tank crews were forced to abandon their vehicles when they ran out of fuel, effectively reducing the number of operational tanks available to the Wehrmacht. In addition to fuel shortages, the German tanks also suffered from mechanical unreliability. The Tiger II, while a formidable weapon on paper, was plagued by technical issues that made it difficult to maintain in the field. The complex engineering of the Tiger II required specialized parts and extensive maintenance, which were increasingly hard to come by as the German war economy crumbled under Allied bombing and resource shortages. The lack of spare parts meant that once a tank broke down, it was often impossible to repair it quickly, leaving it vulnerable to destruction or abandonment. Strategic and tactical miscalculations. The strategic decision to deploy heavy tanks like the Tiger II and Panther in the Ardennes offensive has been widely criticized as a misallocation of resources. These tanks were designed for open field battles where their superior firepower and armor could be fully utilized. However, in the constrained environment of the Ardennes, their advantages were largely nullified. The terrain did not allow for the kind of fast, sweeping maneuvers that had defined earlier German successes, and the heavy tanks were instead forced into grinding, attritional battles that played to the strengths of the defending Allied forces. Moreover, the decision to launch the offensive through the Ardennes was partly based on the success of the 1940 campaign, where German forces had advanced rapidly through the same region. However, this comparison was flawed. In 1940, the German units faced little resistance as they moved through the Ardennes, but in 1944, the situation was entirely different. The American forces were well entrenched and prepared, and the German tanks faced determined opposition from the outset. The terrain that had once been a highway to victory now became a quagmire of stalled advances and failed breakthroughs. The role of Allied air superiority. Another critical factor that contributed to the poor performance of German tanks during the Battle of the Bulge was the overwhelming air superiority of the Allies. Although the offensive began during a period of poor weather, which initially grounded the Allied air forces, the skies eventually cleared, allowing the Allies to bring their full aerial might to bear on the German forces. Allied fighter bombers, known as Jabots by the Germans, were particularly effective at targeting German tanks, supply lines, and convoys. The Tiger II, with its large profile, was an easy target for these aircraft, which could attack with impunity from above. The lack of adequate air cover for the German tanks meant that they were constantly vulnerable to air attacks, further hampering their effectiveness on the ground. The ability of the Allied air forces to disrupt German logistics and destroy key targets also contributed to the overall failure of the offensive. Supply convoys were frequently targeted, leading to further shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. This relentless pressure from the air made it nearly impossible for the German tanks to sustain their momentum, even when they managed to achieve local successes on the ground. The impact of Allied armor and tactics. While the German tanks, particularly the Tiger II, were feared for their firepower and armor, they were not invincible. The American M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the US armored forces, played a crucial role in countering the German offensive. Although the Sherman was outgunned and out-armored by the Tiger II, it had several advantages that proved decisive in the Battle of the Bulge. The Sherman was much more mechanically reliable than the German tanks, and its simpler design allowed for quicker repairs in the field. This meant that damaged Shermans could often be returned to service faster than their German counterparts, ensuring that the American forces maintained a numerical advantage in armored vehicles. Additionally, the Sherman was equipped with a faster turret traverse mechanism, allowing it to bring its gun to bear on targets more quickly than the German tanks. The introduction of the Sherman Firefly, a variant equipped with a powerful 76mm gun, also helped level the playing field. The Firefly's gun was capable of penetrating the armor of the Tiger II, giving the Allies a tank that could effectively challenge the German heavy tanks in direct combat. The combination of numerical superiority, mechanical reliability, and improved firepower allowed the American armored forces to hold the line against the German offensive and eventually push the Wehrmacht back. The psychological and moral dimensions. The failure of the German tanks in the Battle of the Bulge was not just a matter of logistics and tactics. It also had a significant psychological impact on both sides. The German tank crews, facing constant fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and relentless air attacks, were demoralized and exhausted. The realization that their once mighty panzers were no longer the invincible war machines of earlier campaigns weighed heavily on their morale. On the Allied side, the sight of German tanks bogged down in the mud, or abandoned due to lack of fuel, became a symbol of the Wehrmacht's decline. Far from inspiring fear, the German tanks were often mocked by American soldiers, who referred to the Tiger II as a Tyrannosaurus that was too big and too dumb to succeed. This shift in perception marked a turning point in the psychological aspect of the war, as the Allies began to see the German war machine as increasingly vulnerable and beatable. The Battle of the Bulge, despite its initial shock and the damage it inflicted on the Allied forces, ultimately demonstrated the limits of German military power in the late stages of World War II. The failure of the German tanks in this campaign highlighted the broader issues facing the Third Reich, from resource shortages and logistical challenges to strategic miscalculations and the growing effectiveness of the Allied forces. As the final major offensive of Nazi Germany, the Battle of the Bulge marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's regime, with the failure of the German tanks serving as a potent symbol of that decline.